My name is Manuel Essler. Welcome everybody to this event. I'm the director of the Institute of Criminology, and I just wanted to briefly say hello and what a great pleasure it is to welcome you all here to this launch of the 7th edition of the Oxford Handbook of Criminology. We're going to have this launch event first, and then at around 6:30, we will be going upstairs, and there will be a party, something to eat and something to drink and celebrate this extraordinary achievement. And with that, because I know that the longer I speak, the more time it is until we get drinks. And so I just directly hand over to Alison.
Thank you all very much for coming. I'm going to save my introductions for 1 second because we also have Amy from OUP who is going to say a few words before we get started.
Hello everyone, you just about see me over the lectern. My name is Amy Chang. I am the Assistant Portfolio Manager in the law team at OUP. Some of you might know me or my emails. It's an absolute honour to be here with you today, celebrating the launch of the new edition of the Oxford Handbook of Criminology. As was the previous edition, this book is a mammoth project. You can see it right here, and there are some dotted around the room. This time there are 43 chapters and over 85 contributors to the book. Requires not only time from those involved, and who has time during a global pandemic, but also dedication and ample patience. I'd like to thank all of the chapter contributors for all your time and effort throughout the process, and of course, your expertise and cutting-edge research. And I know many students and academics are looking forward to exploring the wide range of topics that our brilliant and diverse pool of contributors have to offer. More importantly, I'd like to thank our editors, Alison, Shad, and Leslie. You've built on the successes of the 6th edition, continuing to shape the book to your inspiring vision and cementing its refreshed identity. So from the team at OUP and from students across the world, if I may, thank you. We are continuously grateful for your partnership and your wisdom.
Thank you very much. And just so that you all know, we have 57 online attendees, as well as all of you in the room, including quite a few chapter authors. So there's we have to imagine them with us. So welcome again, both in-person and online attendees. I'll just do some introductions to start with. So Shad Maruna, in case you don't know, is Professor of Criminology at Queen's University, Belfast, and President of the American Society of Criminology. Leslie Macara is a Professor of Penology in the Law School at the University of Edinburgh and co-director of the Edinburgh Study of Youth Transitions and Crime. And then we have a fine selection of chapter authors on our front row here. So Andy Aidan Aitchison is Senior Lecturer in Criminology at the University of Edinburgh Law School. Nikki Padfield is Professor Emeritus, I think I have to say, of Criminal and Penal Justice at the Law Faculty here. And Rod Earle is Senior Lecturer in the School of Health, Wellbeing and Social Care at the Open University. I think we're also expecting David Honeywell, but he may be on his way still. I'm Alison Liebling, in case you don't know me or I don't know you. Shad, and so I'll just describe proceedings. Shad and Leslie will both say something about the handbook, and then our 3 chapter authors will each say some words about their contributions and maybe about criminology more generally. Then we hope to have a lively discussion with you all about the role, shape, and meaning of the handbook in our field. Is it still meaningful to think of it as a handbook of mainly British criminology? What does that term even mean to those of us who grew up in it, or those who may have felt excluded from it? What's good about it, and should we keep doing it? Most important question. And then, as Manuel said, you're all invited to a catered reception afterwards upstairs in order to mingle with us and each other and hopefully to continue the discussions. So I'm personally excited to launch and celebrate what I think is the prettiest edition, how the scheme works, and it might be the heaviest. I think it might be the edition we're most proud of. As you know, it's our second. And taking on this role is both an honour and a deep responsibility. We had a steep learning curve preparing our first edition, and I wonder whether this time we've got into our stride a bit more. We've tried to capture new developments in the field, as well as make room for some neglected topics, and still cover as much of the existing ground as possible. We've encouraged co-authorship, and we've lowered the average age of chapter authors quite a lot, appropriately, as a next fourth generation of criminologists emerge, making us feel impossibly like the old guard we used to both revere in a way and resent. We're unlikely to manage the 5 editions our predecessors accomplished, some of you might be relieved to hear. Those of you who are new to our discipline may not realise how scary it feels to remember the thrill of the appearance of the first edition in 1994, the bigger thrill of becoming a co-author in a later edition, and then the sheer madness of becoming an editor. And on that subject, I want to pay tribute to my co-editors, Shad and Leslie, who are amazing to work with. I wouldn't do this without them. One of the highlights of the process is getting together with them in York and in Edinburgh so far to talk about the state of criminology as we prepare our introduction. They're both really smart, totally immersed in the field, and great company. So what more could I wish for? And we're all agreed that all of our chapter authors have worked very hard to both deliver outstanding work and submit on time. Miraculous, given the experiences we've all lived through in the last 2 years. So thank you to all of you. Oxford University have supported us in this project throughout and have co-sponsored the reception we'll enjoy later. And there are flyers at the back offering a discount for those who haven't bought one yet. So thank you again and welcome from me, and I'd like to hand over to Shad.
Thanks for that, and I'd also like to thank my 2 co-editors. It was a journey and a much more pleasant one having them along. I was assigned the role to do some analysis, content analysis. Did a troll through 80 million or billion tweets on Twitter to see what the buzz was about the new edition of the handbook. This is my hand. Yeah, that's good. And it was, and we were really delighted to see just how much interest there was in the handbook, but also how the occasion of publishing a new edition caused so much reflection on the handbook and its role in the history of British criminology and the individual histories, life histories of so many criminologists. Okay. Yeah, is there a button in here? Okay. So apologies to the folks that can't see me fumbling for. I'm still fumbling. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Fumbling. Okay. I did something. So Colin Atkinson, I'm going to start with his tweet. Congratulations, but he says he's been recommending this book to all of his students as an investment in themselves, money well spent and so useful for all criminology and criminal justice students, will last a full degree for sure. And we love that phrase. I wish it had been, he tweeted it earlier. We could have got it on the cover of the book, that investment in yourselves. I think this was Rod's tweet who's here. When many people, when the new edition came out, started reflecting back on that initial handbook that came out in 1995 and where they were and in their degree when that first handbook came out. He says he was it was a snippet, and the remainder been chucked to be with colleagues from the British Convict Criminology in this edition. Now, many years later, Carol McCartney is something similar. Wonderful, delighted, but also horrified that we're now on a 7th edition. She remembers getting that first edition when she was a final year in undergraduate, and it just a bit too late for her degree. In the conversation afterwards, she says she remembers a colleague once kept all of his old editions to compare with the new one, which she found bizarre. And then now she had wished that she had kept her old editions as well. A couple of people on Twitter showed off that they had kept all their editions and were awaiting the 7th edition to add to their collection. And Tom Sutton, a publisher himself, said he found a copy of the original Oxford Handbook in a charity shop in Loughborough. I'm sure it was a bargain to get a collector's item like this. So, some people, again, reflected depending where they were in their journey. So David Hockey was a student clearly when the 3rd edition had come out, and he says, this was his favorite edition. He has them all, but you never forget your first. Laura Riley, also a fan of the 3rd edition that she had during her undergraduate studies. And Jen, who started the Black Criminology Network, is a fan of the 5th edition of the Oxford Handbook, because that was where she started her journey back in 2012. Another fan of the 2012 edition, pointing out how it's also useful in terms of weight training, carrying around in his rucksack back in his university days. Mark Brown. Also useful for microphone stands. Useful for you can often put your laptop on it for a Zoom call and these kind of things. An investment in your tech. Also good for cats. Apparently, they like to sleep on the Oxford Handbook. And of course, the hope is, as Skeptism Enterprises points out, that this will be her first edition of the Oxford Handbook, and we hope that this edition will have the same kind of value 10 years, 20 years hence for new students and new lecturers in criminology, and it will have that same kind of role in their academic life course that the previous editions have had. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Okay, moving swiftly on then. So I actually just wanted to begin with some big thank yous from me too. So to all the authors, that everybody who's here, watching online, all of our authors, we literally couldn't have done it without you. So thank you so much for all the efforts, and particularly over the pandemic, when that was actually people were trying to adapt their teaching and their research to very difficult circumstances, and yet most people were on time. Possibly me, I was the latest of the whole people, but most people were on time except me. I want to thank Oxford University Press and the production team as well, because it does a very pretty volume. I was trying to not call it the Dead Teddy volume, because I think that's a nod to the fact that we've actually got sex offending in this chapter, in this handbook for the very first time. But it certainly is a very pretty version. And also, just to be warned, Amy, that when we launched the 6th edition in Edinburgh, the then person we were dealing with in Oxford brought along lots of copies, and I went into the room after the end of the session and they'd all been nicked. That's criminology for you. Anyway, but I also want to thank my fellow editors really warmly, Alison. It's been such a pleasure, such a joyful journey. We don't often get joy in our jobs these days. There's been a joy working with you on this, and our as a collaboration, I think, as well. I feel it's our child sitting up there. So our first main meeting as a second set of editors of this handbook was in 2013, actually, at the ESC conference in Budapest. We sat down, we had some nice wine, and we talked about, kind of plotted how we might take forward the handbook, a somewhat daunting legacy given the legacy of the founding editors. Mike Maguire, Rob Morgan and Rob Reiner. And the changing of the guard, in this changing of the guard, so to speak, I think we were really delighted that all three of them were in the 6th edition, and Rob Reiner is still in this edition too. So we're really, really pleased about that. We've approached our task, both for the 6th and 7th edition, really as a research project, aiming for the volume to be reflective of the best of criminology as practiced across these isles, but also to be constitutive and a gender setting too. And this, of course, necessitates probably going beyond the borders of the UK in terms of both authorship, but also in terms of subject matter. And I'm going to come back to what we might think of as British criminology at the end of my remarks, if I've got time. The esteem in which the Oxford Handbook brand is held is evidenced by the fact that people really want to be in it. Hardly anybody has ever said no to us, and people feel honoured to be asked to be in it. And indeed, I mean, when I think about my first buying of the first edition, thinking, wow, this is an amazing book, would want to be in it one day. And then actually to be editor was something I never really contemplated might be within my career. So, I mean, for me, it feels like an honour to be involved in editing it. And what I'm particularly proud of, something that Alison's already alluded to, is that we have opened up the authorship beyond just what you might call the usual suspects, but to a new generation of scholars. And in curating this edition, we've aimed to give such scholars a role in framing the future of our discipline. Essentially, what we hope we have created is actually a handbook for criminology. That's what we're hoping to have created. Now, if you've read the introductory chapters to the 6th and 7th editions, and why haven't you read them if you haven't? And you should. Alison Shan and I have self-described as these third generation criminologists, taught by and following the paradigm-busting second generation criminologists such as Jock Young, or Pat Carl, Stan Cohen, and many more. But just as the late 1960s and the 1970s can be described as a critical juncture for both theory and method in criminology, a big bang, as self-described by the critical criminologists, so too are the times that we are living through now, the capacity for transformation. The concatenation of crisis that we're all experiencing, the form of the backdrop to our lives, the fallout from things like the global pandemic, the cost of living crisis, the climate emergency, the wider geopolitical tensions with the war in Ukraine, and now the conflict that is emerging within the Middle East again. All of these raise questions which actually are inherently criminological in orientation. As we write in our introduction, they raise questions such as citizenship and democratic living, the nature and consequences of crime control and penal practice, the genesis of poverty, trauma and other social and environmental harms, the legacies of colonialism and empire, atrocity crimes, migration, transitional justice, and more. And what we've tried to capture in this edition is some of the diversification and transformation across our discipline as it grapples with such questions. Diversification in terms of ways of being a criminologist, with actually a growth in activism, which I very much welcome across the criminological spectrum, and ways of doing criminology with an absolute explosion of creative methodologies emerging. So it's a really exciting time, I think, to be involved in criminology. Whilst this for me demonstrates the relevance and indeed the critical salience of criminology as a field of study, and one that students really still flock to, people want to study this, they're excited by it, the very diversification described does present some risks that we need to be thinking about, risks of splintering of the field and a redrawing of some of the intellectual battlegrounds, which we felt in 2017 at the 6th edition, that they may have been dissipated a bit at that time, but I think we're a bit more squabblesome, perhaps, within criminology. Whilst epistemic disruption is a welcome and actually necessary prerequisite of new insight and modes of knowledge production, as scholars, we need to always be nurturing of each other and engage in debate with appropriate humility, always with deep respect. We can be kind in our scholarship. That's something I think is really important, and not least because there is so much still to be done. In my own chapter on youth justice, I've highlighted some of the progressive aspects of policy change that occurred in recent years. There are some negative things happening, but there are some progressive aspects of it, influenced by research evidence as well. So things like the massive reduction in the number of young people in custody in Scotland is at the lowest level for over 50 years, probably since records began. And a bill is now in front of the Scottish Parliament to abolish custody for the under 18s, notwithstanding the fact that the adult population is actually exploding. And also things in England as well, the adoption of the child first offender second ethos. And that's England belatedly following what was happening in Wales a few decades earlier. But all of this, I think, is now at risk as we have governments both in Scotland and in Westminster that are in their dog days. And there is a rhetoric about tough on crime now beginning to emerge. So there's something still to be done, there's work still to be done. What I think unifies many of the chapters across the handbook, not all of them, but many of them, is this very strong commitment to social justice and efforts to set out a positive agenda for change. Calls for compassionate criminology in dealing with sex offenders from Nick Blagden and Belinda Winder. Calls for analysis centering the traumatic legacies of racist dispossession and violence from Coretta Phillips, Ben Bowling and Arthur Palmer. Calls to build a humanistic criminology foregrounding human betterment and fulfilment from Michelle Byrne and Lorraine Gelsthorpe. Calls for a green criminology fighting for environmental justice from A.B. Brisman and Nigel South. Calls for a criminology which conducts research with people, a democratic agenda from Ian Loder, Richard Spark, Ben Bradford, Ryan Casey, Evie Gerling and Gosia Polanski, and one which is committed to challenging state power from Vicky Canning, Paddy Hilliard and Stephen Toons. If such calls continue to inspire students and researchers to push the boundaries of research and education, then I think we will have done our job. And finally, then, just returning to the question of what is British criminology and what my remarks suggested about the nature of British criminology. As reflected, I hope, in this volume, a British criminology cannot be narrow and parochial. It is formed partly of research practice in these isles. It includes research about varied jurisdictions across these isles. But if we are to be constitutive as well as reflective, we need to move beyond these borders. A British criminology needs to embrace global and transnational issues as much as local ones. And we need to propel a sense of self-reflection about what it is we can learn from elsewhere. I really hope that you enjoy reading and engaging with this handbook. We are deeply proud of it, and it's been a true labour of love. So thank you all for coming along today. That's my remark.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start with thanks to the editors as well for pulling together what I think is an amazing and inclusive vision, as you say, for criminology, not just of criminology. I'd like to thank my co-authors as well. So I'm Andy Iden-Aitchison, one of the authors of the chapter on atrocity criminology, but it was written with Mirza Bulibašić in Sarajevo and Barbara Hola in Amsterdam. And it's been a great experience writing with them. I think they rein in some of my worst impulses, among other things. It is wonderful, if an absolutely horrible necessity, to have a chapter on atrocity in the handbook. It has become, I think, a significant area in terms of criminology, both qualitatively and quantitatively, in terms of the work that is being done now. And actually, which started like your gathering together as editors in Budapest, which was the first of the ESCs where a working group on atrocity, crime and transitional justice presented a series of panels. It's not new to the handbook, of course, although this is the first time there's been a dedicated chapter. I think I'd want to recognise Penny Green and Tony Ward's work on state crime beforehand, which actually informed some of what we do in our chapter, and the work that's been done on transitional justice in the handbook before as well. So hopefully we add to that in useful and important ways. Our chapter starts and finishes in Bosnia-Herzegovina for several reasons. But importantly, I think that's one of the two sites of major atrocities in the 1990s that triggered the new ad hoc international tribunals. And they themselves precede shortly the beginnings of a really sustained criminological attention to the problem of atrocity. But arguably, there has never not been a time or a place in criminology where it would not have been appropriate to talk about atrocity. And in our chapter, we do talk about some of the little historical glimpses that we get of criminologists taking this as a problem. Durkheim looking at the bombing of open cities during the First World War, Gluck and his foundational work on what we do with atrocity offenders, how we handle that. Nils Christie, who looks at basic criminological ideas about the connection between age and offending in the context of Nazi camps in Norway during the Second World War. So there have been little glimpses, but at the same time, a certain irony, particularly in the context of British criminology, because the editors in their introduction note the importance of a number of migrants coming into the UK during the quarter, just before the Second World War, who really were here for the growth of post-war criminology in the UK. They note it in terms of the impact of migration on criminology and the intellectual fervour that contributes to. In our chapter, we note it as a slight irony because those people, Grunhut, Mannheim, Rajinovich, Norbert Elias, they were here because of atrocity. Yet at the same time, it took a long time for criminology to turn its lens onto atrocity. As I say, there's never a time that it's not appropriate to talk about this. Today, there are so many situations that it's actually easy to overlook all the places in the world in which atrocity is taking place, partly because the public discourse around atrocity is often attached to a media that will focus on what is most proximate, what is most accessible, what is most recent, what is most dramatic. These cases that rightly call for attention, and I'm sure we all have several examples in our mind as I talk, but of course this might then lead us to overlook equally important sites of atrocity: West Papua, Tigray, North and South Kivu, Xinjiang. So I think there's a lot of work still to be done to understand what is going on in these diverse and disparate places. What are the driving forces? Much to look at tragically, but the chapter shows that criminologists are starting to, and have been, I think, over about the last 20 years especially, contributing to a much bigger scholarly endeavour that goes beyond the discipline itself. But particularly, we've got a lot to offer in terms of looking at the criminalisation of atrocity, looking at the etiology of atrocity in terms of victims and perpetrators, and particularly looking at penalty. What do we do after atrocity? I think there are a lot of specific features of atrocity crime that might differentiate it from other crimes. And I suspect that this is true for anyone who's specialising in a particular form of crime here or in the audience. But I think this creates an interesting tension. The question is, to what extent do we go off on our own and specialise in these? Or how much do we manage to maintain our conversations with a larger criminological audience, with other subdisciplinary branches? And I think actually this is a dilemma that mirrors earlier concerns that were there in the very first handbook about 30 years ago, when David Garland was speaking about the risk of losing those conversations between criminology and other foundational disciplines. And I actually think it's probably a sign of the stage of growth in criminology that we can have these internal worries. I guess the other thing is that we shouldn't lose sight of those worries about our connections with outside disciplines. So interesting times ahead. Hopefully we've made a useful contribution to that. And hopefully people will also post about it on Mastodon and not just on Twitter, as I think that's definitely where the future of criminological and academic posting more generally should be. Thinking about something that is not owned by any particular billionaire with their own political agenda.
Sadly, I don't bring down the average age in this, but my co-author does, so that's all right. Thank you so much for inviting us to contribute and for inviting me to talk today. I'm Nikki Padfield, and with Sarah Spater, we wrote a new chapter in the handbook, and we were really pleased to be invited to contribute a chapter on understanding penal decision-making, looking at courts, sentencing and parole. So we attempted in our book to look at the knowledge which has been gained over recent decades into sentencing and decision-making. And I think in some ways our chapter shows, as of course do lots of other chapters, the breadth of criminology today. So our emphasis, I started life very much as a lawyer, our emphasis is socio-legal, if you like, We're certainly not only interested in the legal framework, but much, much more in the social reality of decision making, the daily realities of sentencing and parole, and indeed the implications for research and policy. We explore decision making by looking at what different players do within the process, seeing how their decision making is shaped by the law, but so much more. Cyrus is a fantastic person to work with. He hoped to be here, but I don't actually know if he's here. It is half term, as lots of people know. Cyrus is Professor of Law and Criminal Justice at Strathclyde. He's Director of the Centre for Law, Crime and Justice. He's Chair of the European Group on Sentencing and Penal Decision Making, and is an exciting person to work with. Lots of you might have read his Sentencing as a Social Process, Rethinking Research and Policy. Much more recently, he's co-edited Criminal Justice and the Ideal Defendant in the Making of Remorse and Responsibility. But one of the things that I think this handbook does so well, bringing people together, he's a bundle of energy, academic curiosity, and just a lovely person to work with. So it was only a pleasure writing this chapter. So what did we write about? I think our central idea was that decision-making is a process rather than a momentary event, not a one-off formal act. So then we started off having great debates about what we saw as the essential features of process, and we got it down to 5 and then 7 and ended up with 6. But we did have some really good discussions along the way. So process, we felt, made us focus on the reality of decision making, the interconnection between formally separate decision making moments. We looked at how cases, human beings involved in cases, are constructed by and transformed through the process. We had good debates about the professional culture and group behaviour which shapes decision making. Discretion had to be one of our key issues. Certainly it's been something that I've been interested in. A lot of us, including you, Lorraine, who I don't think is here, maybe she's online. We co-edited a book on discretion in the criminal justice decades ago. And discretion is in many ways the heartbeat of the criminal justice process. And we were really keen to think a bit about the implications of our realization of the importance of listening to the experiences of people who are subject to punishment when you're trying to understand the process. So we had lots of good discussions about process, which I hope will be provocative. We hope very much that we will provoke a response. One of the interesting questions, I think, for today is this publication is in itself the beginning of a process. And how does the conversation continue? And will we get lots of emails from people who want to pick up ideas in different factors and so on? It'll be interesting to do that. We also, within our chapter, look at 5 assumptions which are often made by policymakers, professional people, all sorts of errors, in a sense, which have fitted into criminal justice thinking. The presumption of innocence, that cases are unique, that criminal justice agencies work autonomously in penal decision-making. Controversially, perhaps, that strategies to reduce the use of imprisonment should rely on promoting alternatives to imprisonment. Something which has to be said rather loudly to our Minister of Justice at this particular moment in time. And then a theme very close to my heart, challenging the idea that sentencing is a one-off event, a one-off process, which judges do at the beginning of a sentence. No, it too is a process. Thinking about what I actually wanted to say now by way of thank you, in a sense, is just to reflect, as many of us old hands in particular will realise, it's really difficult to know where to publish your work. You want people to read what you've written, but actually, you know, very often, particularly in law faculties, we tend to publish in journals which not many people read, and then you get your promotion, but actually you would rather that people were reading what you have written. And I think an opportunity to write in this Oxford Handbook is a real opportunity to engage with an audience, to find an audience which is actually interested in the subject. And so on behalf of Cyrus and myself, thank you very much for having us on board.
Hi, thanks very much. My name's Rod Earl, and I, along with 5 colleagues, wrote the Convict Criminology Without Guarantees chapter. And again, I will start by saying, thank you, generous editors, been so supportive and fundamentally so inclusive. There were 5 of us involved in this chapter. Danica Darley, Bill Davies, Dave Honeywell, Ed Screech-Powell. And we thought we'd probably be the biggest collective sort of authorship in the book. And then we discovered that the load gang snipped it from us. But we are very proud to have been part of this collection because, the people in the Oxford Handbook have sort of, in various ways, inspired us, stimulated our interest, and sort of developed our appetite for criminology. So it does feel really good to be in the book. I was going to have a couple of the other authors, Ed Screech-Powell and Dave Honeywell, were hoping they'd be here. Danica couldn't make it. She just said it's a long way to go for a couple of hours, isn't it? Bill Davies doesn't sort of do this kind of thing, I think. And Ed's clutch fell out of his car, and he was going to drive here. Dave Honeywell's running marathons, so he's probably running, he might still turn up. Anyway, our sort of chapter tells the story of convict criminology as a sort of relative newcomer to criminology's ever-widening shores. And it reflects also this sort of new growth, a second generation coming through in the UK after our first panel on convict criminology, which was held at the British Society of Criminology Annual Conference in 2011. So over 10 years ago, and Dave and Bill and I were at those early gatherings. But having been joined in the last couple of years by Danica and Ed has been a tremendous sort of boost to our work. In the chapter, in the handbook, Danica speaks to the sort of distinctive experience of women who've been in prison and who are now doing criminology. And she's able to reference the work of other sort of convict criminologists like Dr. Sinan Bosworth from Westminster and Jennifer Ortiz in the USA, who demonstrate the importance of feminist perspectives in convict criminology. The chapter sort of tries to show the various ways of doing convict criminology. And that often involves setting up classes of criminology in various prisons. And I think some of the desire to do this stems from our experience of what Deb Drake calls the fiasco of prison. That sort of great travesty that you discover when you get sent down, how different it looks on the inside from how it's meant to be from the outside. It promises so much, but delivers so little. And from the outside, I think prisons tend to sort of project or reflect, philanthropic, progressive ideas. Inside prisons, you find much more that's misanthropic, I think. They often succeed in making life worse. So convict criminologists have sort of this intimate experience of that mismatch. And I think it's sort of what propels us to write, to try and sort of understand this extraordinary difference of what sort of prison is meant to be and what it actually is. So part of our chapter sort of critically examines the issue of lived experience of imprisonment and why lived experience is increasingly coming to be seen as a significant form of knowledge for criminologists. And it's nice to see that occurring in several sort of chapters. It sort of speaks to this idea of the sort of provenance of your knowledge, what gives it authority. So you've got this idea, trust me, I'm a doctor. I've waded through the data, I've read all the books, so trust me, I'm a doctor, I know what I'm talking about. Or the simple, trust me, I've been there, I know what I'm talking about. And that's a very sort of controversial contrast, there's a lot of tensions in that difference. You'll all, I'm sure, remember sort of Michael Gove's assertion in the 2016 Brexit campaign, when he said people in this country have had enough of experts. And this was seen as a kind of classic statement of post-truth politics, where evidence, rational judgment, and scientific truths are discarded in favour of populist appeals for raw feeling, intuition, or experience. So the experts who sort of make and design computers or vacuum cleaners, they're not the experts that we're meant to be sceptical. I don't know anyone who's not flying, because they're worried about the experts who design the aeroplanes. But they are worried. I think they have in mind, I think that sort of comment is directed at the experts in social sciences, in the humanities, in our discipline of criminology. And they have in mind, I think, this kind of people who are sort of telling people how to live, how society should work. And where does that knowledge come from? And it comes from places like this in Cambridge, incredibly wealthy places. And it speaks to people without wealth, I think, in this kind of slightly sort of awkward tone. And that's why I think the question of experience is becoming very salient, but very vexatious. And we try and tackle that issue in our chapter. The universities, of course, were originally designed to educate wealthy white men. The US poet Adrian Rich called them a breeding ground, not of humanism, but of masculine privilege. And I think in our chapter, we try to show how convict criminology exists in this sort of strange gaps and overlaps between the two institutions, between the prison and universities. And we sort of try and challenge and provoke a little bit the idea that universities are exclusively places of virtue, as it were, and that they have some questions to answer, as many questions in some ways as the prison. And we're saying, I suppose, if you graduated from both of those institutions, perhaps you have got something interesting to say, something to offer criminology. So I'll leave it there, but thanks again for our inclusion in this volume.
Thank you very much to all of our speakers. What we're hoping is that we can now return to the basic questions that we asked at the beginning. So we have questions as editors. Should there be another Oxford Handbook of Criminology? What's this concept of British criminology? Does it make sense in the modern world? Are there gaps that we should be thinking about? What's the relationship between the handbook and the British Society of Criminology and all the other societies of criminology that have proliferated since the Oxford Handbook was first invented? What is it that students want from a book like this and from the criminological community? So,
decolonize the Oxford Handbook.
Should we decolonize the Oxford Handbook? So, we would welcome questions, comments. I think if you think of us as a panel, not just the editors, but the chapter providers too, and there are other chapter authors in the audience, both here and online. So we might take a few questions and comments, and then we'll see what we want to do in response. So anyone have a burning question or comment?